It was on the evening of the harvest festival, when the bells of St. Mary Mead chimed sweetly over the meadows and lanterns swung from cottage eaves, that the first whisper of something odd came to light. The parish pond, that unassuming circle of water at the village's edge, had always been a place of idle chatter. Ducks, children, lovers, and once a runaway goose. But never, until that night, the subject of dread. Mrs. Hartnell had been the first to see it. She was walking back from the churchyard after the festival supper, the soft mist curling about her ankles like smoke, when she caught sight of a pale figure standing by the pond's edge. A woman, it seemed, in a flowing grey gown that shimmered faintly under the lantern light, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. Mrs. Hartnell called out, thinking it some parish girl gone astray, but the figure turned, not toward her, but toward the water, and vanished with scarcely a ripple. By morning, half the village had heard the tale. Mr. Price, the grocer, told his customers that ghosts never appeared without reason. Mrs. Weatherby at the post office swore it must be the restless soul of poor Alice Tynan, drowned there some 20 years ago. The vicar urged calm, but his wife could not help recalling that odd letter the church had received last week, unsigned and with a single sentence inside. "The pond remembers." When Miss Marple heard of the apparition, she did not scoff. She merely smiled faintly over her knitting and remarked to Mr. Raymond, who had come to fix her garden gate, that people often see what their conscience permits. It was not until the following evening, when a body was found floating among the reeds, that her quiet observation began to seem rather more than idle wisdom. The deceased was Henry Collis, the church's organist, and by general agreement, a peculiar man. He had lived alone in the old caretaker's cottage by the lane, known for his evening walks and his habit of stopping by the pond to listen to the water. The villagers' horror was immediate, their fascination even greater. The constable shook his head gravely. "Accident, most like," he said. "He slipped, perhaps. Mud's thick there after rain." But Miss Marple, who stood on the lane just beyond the crowd, noted the careful way Collis's hat was set upon the bank. She noted, too, that the pond was oddly still, as though it had already told its story and no one had listened. And in that instant, she began to suspect that the apparition was no ghost at all. The news of Henry Collis's death spread through St. Mary Mead with the same quiet determination as ivy across a church wall. By mid-morning, every window curtain along the high street fluttered with curiosity. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had already taken it upon herself to comfort Mrs. Hartnell, who by now had convinced herself that the ghost had lured the poor man to his doom. At the butcher's, someone whispered that Collis had been seen arguing with the verger only days before. At the post office, another insisted he'd been expecting a visitor from London. Yet no one seemed to know who that visitor might be. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her morning as usual, tending to her roses, pausing only to note that the police constable had paid 3 separate visits to the pond before breakfast. She thought that rather telling. Inspector Graves, a stolid man with a face like unbaked dough, had come down from Melchester shortly after. He had the manner of one who believed the matter could be neatly folded and filed within a day or two. "It appears Mr. Collis slipped," he declared later that afternoon at the vicarage tea, stirring his cup with an air of finality. "No sign of struggle, no marks of violence, accidental drowning most likely. Case closed unless the coroner says otherwise." Miss Marple looked mildly up from her knitting. "It must be very distressing for his poor sister," she said softly. "Indeed. Miss Ada Collis. She's arriving from Bath this evening," replied Mrs. Clement, ever efficient in matters of news. Apparently they weren't close. Still, one must feel for her. Miss Marple nodded but said nothing more. She had noticed the faintest twitch in Inspector Graves's expression, that momentary unease of a man who prefers tidy answers to untidy facts. She had also heard, though no one else seemed to have, that the key to Collis's cottage had been missing from his coat pocket when they found him. That evening, as twilight gathered over the thatched roofs, Miss Marple took her customary walk. She passed by the churchyard, where shadows lay deep among the gravestones, and paused by the pond. The police had left it cordoned off with a single length of rope, fluttering faintly in the wind. The surface of the water was smooth again, save for the circling of a lone duck. She stood quite still, thinking of Mrs. Hartnell's story, the pale figure, the vanished shape, and wondered whether fear had made the good woman see more than was there, or whether someone had rather counted on it. The next morning brought a change. Miss Ada Collis arrived on the 10:15 train, tall and sharp-featured, with the sort of face that seemed carved to hold in bitterness. She refused the vicar's offer of lodging and went straight to her brother's cottage, demanding the key from the constable in a tone that brooked no argument. The villagers watched her from behind curtains as she unlocked the door and disappeared inside. An hour later she re-emerged, pale and trembling. "They've taken something," she said to anyone who would listen. There was a box, an old oak box he kept beneath his piano bench. He never let me see what was in it. And now it's gone. Inspector Graves frowned deeply when told. "Probably nothing important," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Sentimental nonsense. Miss Marple, who happened to be arranging flowers at the church just then, remarked quietly, "Sentiment can be quite dangerous, Inspector, when it's attached to the wrong memory." Later that day, she received a visit from young Tommy Wells, the gardener's boy, who was fond of bringing her bits of gossip in exchange for biscuits. "Saw Mr. Collis that night, miss," he confided. "Night he went in the water. He weren't alone, neither. There was someone waiting for him by the pond. A woman, I think. Had a shawl on. They was arguing, though not loud." Miss Marple thanked him, her eyes thoughtful. A woman. That would please Mrs. Hartnell no end. Yet there was something in Tommy's manner. The hesitancy, the memory of light reflected on water, that made her wonder whether the boy had seen more than he knew how to describe. When she called on Miss Collis the next morning, the sister was already sorting through piles of old sheet music. "He was mad, you know," Ada said curtly. "He fancied himself a composer, never published a note, always scribbling about the past, things best forgotten." "Forgotten things have a way of returning," Miss Marple murmured, "especially when they concern the living." Ada shot her a look, but Miss Marple's face remained placid, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. She was gazing at a faded photograph on the mantel, a group of parish singers taken years ago. There was Henry, younger and smiling, beside a woman whose face had been carefully cut out of the frame. When she left the cottage, Miss Marple stopped once more by the pond. The air was heavy with rain, and the church bells tolled faintly in the distance. She thought of the missing key, the vanished box, and the woman no one seemed able to name. It was curious, she reflected, how the past could hide itself so successfully, until the water chose to give something back. By the time she reached home, she had already written 3 names neatly in her notebook and drawn a small question mark beside each. She did not yet know which of them had stood by the parish pond that night, but she was quite certain the apparition had flesh and blood, and that its reason for appearing was something far more earthly than the villagers dared imagine. The following days brought a strange hush over St. Mary Mead. The usual cheer of morning greetings seemed subdued, and even the sparrows that gathered on Miss Marple's window ledge sang more softly, as though aware that something dark had seeped into the air. The constable had completed his report and sent it to Melchester, but the villagers whispered that Inspector Graves looked less confident each passing day. He had questioned Mrs. Hartnell again, mostly to humor her, one suspected, but her description of the ghostly figure had grown more dramatic with each retelling. By now the spectral lady wore a veil and drifted above the water like smoke. Miss Marple, who had sat quietly during the exchange, only smiled faintly. People, she thought, often embroidered the truth to make it fit their fears. She spent that morning sorting through parish records with the vicar's permission, her reasoning simple and polite. "Just a small curiosity, dear Mr. Clement. It occurred to me that poor Henry Collis may have had some connection to the old Tynan matter." The vicar, ever accommodating, fetched the dusty ledgers. Within an hour, Miss Marple had confirmed what she half suspected. The Tynan girl, Alice, had been part of the church choir once, years ago, the same year Henry had joined as organist. The entry beside her name was marked in red ink. Resigned, June 1908. That was the summer she drowned. Miss Marple closed the ledger slowly, her eyes thoughtful. When she emerged from the vestry, she saw Inspector Graves waiting by the gate, his hat pulled low against the drizzle. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone cautious, "I suppose you've heard that nothing came of the autopsy? Water in the lungs. Death by drowning, simple as that." "Indeed," she said mildly. "Though drowning is a curious sort of accident for a man who disliked water, don't you think?" He blinked. "Disliked water?" "Oh, yes. Mr. Collis refused to bathe in the vicarage house when he stayed for repairs last spring. Claimed the pipes sang unpleasantly. Mrs. Clement mentioned it once, quite without malice. A peculiar remark, but these little peculiarities do tend to stick in one's mind." The inspector frowned. "You think it wasn't an accident?" Miss Marple gave a delicate shrug. "I think human nature rarely allows for neat endings. There is usually some untidiness left behind." That evening, the village gathered at the church hall for the postponed harvest supper, rearranged to console rather than celebrate. The air buzzed with uneasy chatter. Miss Collis attended, sitting stiffly in a corner, her eyes darting at every mention of her brother's name. Mrs. Hartnell, flushed with gossip and sherry, declared to anyone who would listen that the ghost had been a warning from the beyond. Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Clement, listening but saying little. She observed instead the small exchanges, the way Ada Collis turned her face sharply when Mr. Price, the grocer, entered, the faint nod he gave her before pretending not to see her at all. There was something rehearsed in that glance, something wary. Later, when Ada rose to leave, Miss Marple followed her quietly into the lane. "My dear," she said gently, "you looked most uncomfortable when Mr. Price came in. You've known him some time, perhaps?" Ada hesitated. "Years ago," she admitted, "before Henry came to St. Mary Mead. We were acquainted." Her mouth tightened. "He fancied himself a friend of the family, but Henry wouldn't have it. He said Price was a gossip and a meddler. They quarreled about money once. Something to do with the church fund." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Money often leaves a longer shadow than love." The next day dawned grey and cold. Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor just after breakfast. Young Constable Webb, hat in hand, cheeks pink with embarrassment. "Beg pardon, miss," he said, "but the inspector asked me to return this. Found near the pond this morning." He held out a small object sealed in a paper bag. It was a brass key dulled by mud, with an ornate head shaped like a treble clef. Miss Marple took it gently. "How very interesting," she murmured. "I should think that belongs to the late Mr. Collis's piano." Webb's eyes widened. "Piano? Then what's it doing down by the water?" She gave him a kindly smile. "That, my dear boy, is precisely the question." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the cottage once more, finding Ada packing her brother's belongings into a trunk. The piano sat open, a few yellowed sheets of music scattered on the floor. When Miss Marple mentioned the key, Ada's face turned rigid. "He must have dropped it," she said too quickly. "He always carried it about." Miss Marple bent to pick up a page of music. The title read, "The Pond Remembers." The notes were uneven, hesitant, as though written by a trembling hand. "Did your brother compose this?" she asked. Ada's voice wavered. "He said it came to him after Alice Tynan died. He couldn't bear to play it." Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, tapping against the window panes. Miss Marple laid the paper back on the stool and said quietly, "Sometimes grief disguises itself as guilt, Miss Collis. And guilt, well, that has a way of resurfacing, even after 20 years. When she left, she lingered at the gate, watching the faint light from the cottage flicker through the mist. Somewhere in the dark, the church bell tolled 6, and a shape moved briefly near the pond's edge. A figure cloaked against the rain, stooping as though searching for something lost. Miss Marple did not call out. She merely noted the direction in which the figure disappeared, and when she finally turned homeward, her mind had already begun to weave the next thread of the pattern that had long been waiting to be seen. The rain that had started as a mist soon turned into a steady curtain, washing the village lanes clean of dust and sound. Miss Marple sat by her window with a pot of tea cooling beside her and her knitting untouched. She was thinking, and when Miss Marple thought, the quiet around her seemed to deepen, as though the air itself leaned closer to listen. The image of the figure by the pond returned to her mind, cloaked, deliberate, not the trembling spectre Mrs. Hartnell had described. There had been purpose in that movement, not haunting. Someone had gone back to retrieve something, or perhaps to make sure nothing had been left behind. The following morning brought confirmation of her suspicion, though not in the form she expected. Inspector Graves appeared at her gate, looking harassed and damp. "I suppose you've heard," he began, his voice curt. "Collis's cottage was broken into last night. Window forced, drawers upturned. The sisters in hysterics again." Miss Marple offered him a dry towel and a seat, which he refused. "And what was taken?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "Nothing of value, far as we can tell, though she claims a packet of letters is missing. Private ones, she says. But frankly, Miss Marple, I doubt a common thief would care about sentimental rubbish." "People seldom steal what they cannot read," she murmured, her eyes distant. "Tell me, Inspector, were the papers disturbed near the piano?" Graves frowned. "Aye, now that you mention it. She said her brother kept drafts of his music there. You don't think—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that those letters and that music might have been part of the same story. One someone wished to finish properly this time." The inspector left with a polite, puzzled nod, and Miss Marple decided to pay a call on the vicarage. Mrs. Clement was in the drawing-room, sorting hymnals, and greeted her warmly. But the vicar's wife, despite her steady cheer, looked uneasy. "I've had the oddest morning, Jane," she confessed. "Mr. Price came to see the vicar, asking if Henry Collis ever confessed anything before he died. Quite out of the blue, too, and he seemed nervous." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Mr. Price is not a nervous man by nature. He must be carrying something rather heavy to look that way. Did he mention what prompted the question?" "Something about old sins coming to light," Mrs. Clement said, lowering her voice. "And then he left abruptly. My dear, what do you suppose it means?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It means that the past has begun to speak, and Mr. Price fears it has remembered his name." Later that afternoon, she stopped by the shop under the pretense of buying sugar. Mr. Price was behind the counter, his hands restless among the paper bags. "Terrible business, this," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "The whole village talking as though we've ghosts walking about again. It's bad for trade, you know." "I imagine it is," she said kindly. "Still, I wonder if perhaps the living have more to answer for than the dead." He looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Only that it's curious how old quarrels resurface. I dare say you and Mr. Collis had your differences years ago." He flushed a dull red. "That was nothing. A misunderstanding, best forgotten." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Though forgetting and forgiving are not quite the same thing, are they? The pond, I find, forgives nothing. It keeps whatever one casts into it, until the time comes to give it back. When she left, she had the distinct impression Mr. Price would pay someone a visit before the night was out, and she meant to find out whom. She asked young Tommy Wells, whose curiosity often proved more useful than official investigation, to keep an eye on the lanes after dusk. He needed no convincing. By 9 o'clock, the boy was at her door, breathless and wet. "Miss, I saw him. Mr. Price down by the pond again. He met the lady what came to the cottage yesterday. Miss Collis, I think." They was arguing, proper shouting this time. He grabbed her arm and she said, "It was you who wrote that letter." Then she ran off. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened. "Thank you, Tommy. That will do for now, and do be sure to tell your mother you're home safe." She sat alone a long while after that, thinking of the unsigned letter, the one that said, "The pond remembers." If Ada Collis believed Price had written it, then the message had been meant for her, not her brother. But why now, after so many years? Unless Henry had discovered something that tied both of them to the girl who drowned all those years ago. At dawn, the village awoke to fresh commotion. A fisherman had found something tangled in the reeds near the bank. A small wooden box, waterlogged but intact, its brass clasp broken. Inside were several letters, blurred with damp, but still legible enough to read the name at the top of each: Alice Tynan. By the time Inspector Graves arrived, Miss Marple was already there, standing quietly with her umbrella. "So," he said grimly, lifting one of the ruined pages. "Our ghost can write, can she?" "Not a ghost, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently. "Merely a woman wronged and forgotten, and a truth that refused to drown." He stared at her. "You think Collis was killed because of this?" "I think," she replied, watching the ripples spread across the water, "that someone feared what would surface if he played that tune again. But the past, like music, always finds its way back to the right ears." And as she turned toward the lane, the faintest melody seemed to drift through the rain, a fragile echo from somewhere deep beneath the pond, where memory had slept too long. The letters, once dried and carefully laid out on the vicarage table, revealed a story that unsettled even those who thought themselves immune to shock. Alice Tynan, it appeared, had written them in the final weeks before her death. They were addressed to Henry Collis, but there was one among them, later in date and in tone, addressed instead to "My dearest H." It was a letter of despair, not love, written by a young woman betrayed. The ink trailed where tears must have fallen, and the final lines were faint, almost illegible. Miss Marple read them silently while Inspector Graves paced beside her. "She speaks of being cast off for reputation's sake." The inspector muttered, scanning the text. "Says he promised to stand by her, but couldn't risk the parish knowing." Could mean anything. "It means," said Miss Marple softly, "that she was with child, and someone persuaded her to keep silent. That sort of persuasion rarely comes from a kind heart." Graves frowned. "So you think Collis—" "I think," she interrupted gently, "that Henry Collis may have borne a guilt that was not entirely his own. And guilt, Inspector, is rather like a seed. It grows best in the dark." Outside, the wind had begun to rise, sweeping through the churchyard trees. The letters had clearly lain hidden for years, perhaps even deliberately buried in that box, and someone had feared their rediscovery. Miss Marple asked to see the spot where they'd been found. The pond lay still beneath a low sky, its surface grey and glass-like. The reeds shivered faintly at the water's edge. She crouched, peering down. "You see," she said quietly, "it was not the ghost of Alice that frightened Mrs. Hartnell that night. It was the living who came to bury the past once more." The inspector sighed, rubbing his brow. "And yet we've no proof anyone killed Collis. The doctor's report still says accidental drowning." Miss Marple's eyes followed the curve of the bank, where muddy footprints lingered, faint but recent. "Accidents seldom come wearing a second pair of shoes," she murmured. He did not fall. He was pushed or persuaded close enough that the rest took care of itself. By afternoon, the village was alive with gossip again. Mrs. Hartnell had heard that Miss Collis was leaving for Bath immediately. Mrs. Clement said she'd been seen burning papers in the cottage hearth. Miss Marple took this not as proof of guilt, but of fear. When she arrived at the cottage, Ada was indeed packing, her movements sharp and agitated. "You must understand," Ada said quickly when Miss Marple asked about the fire. "I'm not hiding anything, only old rubbish. Henry's notes, drafts, nothing that matters." Miss Marple looked at the ashes, still smouldering faintly. "It's remarkable, isn't it, how often people burn what does not matter?" Ada turned, eyes flashing. "You think I killed him, don't you? Everyone does. But I only wanted him to stop talking about the past, about her. He was obsessed, said he'd seen her face in the pond, that he heard her voice in his music. He frightened me." "Guilt can make ghosts of the living," Miss Marple said kindly. "But fear, my dear, makes murderers." Ada slumped into a chair, trembling. "He told me someone had sent him a note. No name. It said, 'The pond remembers.' He thought it meant her spirit was calling him. I thought it was madness. But perhaps it was meant to warn him. Or to silence him," Miss Marple said softly. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Mr. Price, rain dripping from his hat brim, his expression taut. "I came to see if Miss Collis required any assistance," he said stiffly. "Terrible business, all of it." Miss Marple rose. "How thoughtful of you, Mr. Price, but perhaps it is assistance of another kind you ought to offer. The truth." He froze, color draining from his face. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do. You were seen meeting Miss Collis by the pond 2 nights ago, and I dare say you were there once before, long ago, when a frightened girl was persuaded that her shame would ruin a good man's standing. Tell me, Mr. Price, were you not treasurer of the Parish Fund that summer?" He swallowed hard, glancing between them. I did what I had to. Alice came to me first, begging for help. I gave her money, my own, mind you, to go away quietly. Collis agreed at first, then turned self-righteous. Said he'd confess. Fool. He'd have ruined himself and her memory both. "So you took it upon yourself to save them." Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but her eyes were merciless. And when he began speaking of her again, when he hinted that the truth was coming back, you silenced him as you silenced her. Only this time, the water gave him back. Price's hands shook. He was raving, said the pond was whispering to him that he'd tell the vicar everything. I just wanted to scare him. I pushed, only to make him stop shouting. He stumbled, and the pond did the rest, Miss Marple finished quietly. Ada's sob broke the stillness. Graves arrived moments later, summoned by Miss Marple's earlier note to the station, and took Price away without struggle. Outside, the rain had ceased, and the pond lay mirror still once more. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched again. Mrs. Clement called to say the coroner's verdict would now read death by misadventure. But Miss Marple knew better. There was no need to press the matter. In villages like St. Mary Mead, justice often came not through courts, but through memory and the quiet refusal of the world to forget. She looked toward the darkened lane where the pond shimmered faintly beneath the moon. The water, she thought, had kept its promise. It had remembered everything. The confession might have closed the matter for most people, but Miss Marple felt a faint disquiet that would not rest. Something about the neatness of it all unsettled her. Price's sudden surrender, Ada's trembling relief, and the quiet eagerness with which Inspector Graves had declared the case concluded. St. Mary Mead, being what it was, preferred its tragedies tidy, yet Miss Marple knew human nature rarely obliged. That night, while the village slept in the comfort of resolution, she sat awake in her chair, the faint ticking of the clock the only sound. She replayed Price's words in her mind. He was raving, said the pond was whispering to him. It was an odd thing to invent, and odder still to repeat. Guilt made men defensive, not poetic. By morning, she had resolved to take a small walk. The air had cleared after the storm, and mist still clung to the meadows. When she reached the pond, it lay calm and glassy, yet the reeds near the far bank were flattened in a peculiar way, as though someone had stood there recently. She examined the ground. The soft earth preserved faint marks of shoes larger than Price's. She had noted the man's feet when he was led away, small, neat, practical. These were not his. They belonged to someone heavier, someone who had approached from the opposite path, the one leading toward the vicarage garden. She straightened slowly, her expression unreadable. The church bell began to toll 8. Moments later, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps and turned to see the vicar approaching, his coat buttoned high and his manner unusually brisk. "A fine morning, Miss Marple," he called. "Quite a relief after all this unpleasantness." "Indeed," she said mildly, "though I imagine it's rather more of a relief for some than others." He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "A tragic business, of course, but best laid to rest. Price's confession saves everyone further grief." "Yes," she said, still looking at the water. "So very convenient, isn't it? The dead cannot speak, and the guilty are grateful to be believed." The vicar hesitated. "You sound as though you doubt his guilt." Miss Marple glanced at him then, a fleeting, knowing look. "Doubt, my dear Mr. Clement, is the only safeguard of the truth." Later that day, while the villagers chattered of closure and Inspector Graves packed up his files, Miss Marple visited the church alone. She asked the cleaning woman to leave her for a while and moved through the nave with quiet deliberation. The faint scent of beeswax and damp stone filled the air. At the organ, she paused. Henry Collis's seat was still drawn out slightly, as though expecting him to return. A few crumpled sheets of music lay beneath it, damp, torn, but not yet ruined. She picked them up carefully. The title on one page caught her breath. "Kyrie for Two Voices." That evening she asked Mrs. Clement to join her for tea. "I wonder," she began, "whether your husband might have known of Henry Collis's music. His compositions, I mean. He seemed fond of the man, did he not?" Mrs. Clement stirred her cup distractedly. "Henry often visited, yes. My husband encouraged his choir work, but I think he disapproved of those private compositions. He once told Henry to stop brooding on the old scandal. It was unhealthy, he said." Miss Marple nodded. "Ah, then your husband was aware of the letters, perhaps?" Mrs. Clement looked startled. Well, yes. Henry confided in him once, years ago. My husband persuaded him to forget it all, for everyone's sake. Alice Tynan's death was declared accidental, and nothing could be gained by dredging it up." "Except," said Miss Marple softly, "the truth." The next morning Inspector Graves returned to fetch the last of his things from the station. Miss Marple met him there, ostensibly to deliver a basket of scones for his journey. "Tell me, Inspector," she said pleasantly, "was there ever a note recovered from Collis's pocket that night? You mentioned earlier he'd received one." Graves frowned. "No, nothing of the kind. Only his handkerchief and the missing key we found later." "How curious," she murmured. "Because I rather think someone removed it before you arrived." That evening, while the church choir practiced, Miss Marple slipped quietly into the pews. The vicar stood at the front, giving instructions, his voice measured and clear. When he turned toward the organ, something flickered across his face. Not grief, but irritation, quickly suppressed. He dismissed the singers early, muttering about the damp making the floorboards treacherous. Miss Marple waited until they had gone. "You must have been fond of him," she said gently when they were alone. He startled, then smiled thinly. I respected him. He was troubled, but talented. He was frightened, she corrected. Frightened enough to come to you. I believe he told you that the letters had been found, or that someone was threatening to reveal them, and you, understanding what that would mean for your church, took steps to prevent a scandal. He drew himself up, the air of the pulpit settling about him. You're imagining things, Miss Marple. The man was ill, obsessed. He brought ruin on himself. Ah, she said softly. And yet it wasn't illness that left bruises on his wrists, was it? The coroner noted them, but assumed they were from his fall. I wonder, did you hold him back when he tried to climb from the water, or was it before, when you begged him to stop speaking of the girl he buried twice, once in earth and once in silence? For a long moment there was only the faint creak of the pews. Then he said quietly, "You don't understand, Miss Marple. It was mercy. Alice was my parishioner, my responsibility. When she fell, I did nothing. I let Price and Collis handle it, and I have lived with that ever since. When Henry came to me raving that he heard her voice, I thought, perhaps he'd find peace if he joined her." Miss Marple's face did not change, though a shadow crossed her eyes. Peace, Mr. Clement, is not something one gives. It is earned, often too late. He bowed his head, the weight of his own words collapsing upon him. By the time Inspector Graves returned from the station at her quiet summons, the vicar was still sitting there in the dark, staring at the pond through the open church door. Miss Marple walked home through the fading evening, her steps slow, her mind heavy. The village lights flickered on. One by one, their glow reflected faintly in the still surface of the pond. It would keep its silence again, she thought, as it always had. But she, at least, would remember. The next morning broke with a brittle stillness, the kind that seemed to press down upon the village roofs and hush even the birds. The vicar's arrest had not yet been made public, though Inspector Graves had promised discretion until London sent word. But whispers moved faster than any official notice could, and by noon St. Mary Mead knew that something had happened at the church. The cleaner had seen 2 constables leave with solemn faces. The verger, ever fond of speculation, swore he had heard weeping from the vestry before dawn. Miss Marple, who had no taste for gossip but every interest in truth, received 3 visitors before luncheon, each eager to tell her what they imagined she did not already know. She listened kindly, offered tea, and let them talk themselves into comfort. It was her quiet way of taking the village's temperature, and what she found was not outrage, but a curious relief. There was comfort, she reflected, in believing that sin wore a collar and not one's own face. When they had gone, she sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap. Her mind returned to the vicar's final words the night before, spoken not in defiance, but weariness. Perhaps he'd find peace if he joined her. It was not a confession of malice, but of surrender. She had seen it before, good men undone by their own attempts to keep the world orderly. The pity of it, she thought, was that mercy so often resembled cruelty when viewed in daylight. A knock at the door drew her back. It was Ada Collis, pale and composed, though her eyes bore the dazed look of someone newly unmoored. "I've come to thank you," she said stiffly. "I heard the vicar that he's admitted what happened. It's a dreadful thing, but at least Henry's name is cleared." Miss Marple gestured her inside. "Your brother's peace, my dear, may yet depend on what becomes of those letters. The inspector means to send them on to the coroner, of course, but I imagine you'd rather not see them become public property." Ada hesitated, her hands twisting the strap of her handbag. They were Alice's words, not Henry's. I don't want her shamed again. Can't they be destroyed? Miss Marple looked at her gently. The truth once known does not burn so easily as paper. Still, perhaps it's kinder if the village forgets the details. It will do so in time. It always does. The younger woman nodded uncertainly, then rose to leave. At the door she paused. "There's something else. The night Henry died, he'd written to me. I only found the letter this morning among his music. He said he'd arranged for someone to return a keepsake of Alice's to her family, but the Tynans moved away years ago. He couldn't have meant them. Do you think he gave it to the vicar?" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her tone remained calm. "A keepsake? Did he say what it was?" "No, only that it was small and bound with ribbon. He said he'd kept it too long, and that the water would forgive him if she could not." When Ada left, Miss Marple sat very still. Her thoughts, like neat threads, began to weave themselves together. The vicar had gone to the pond that night, not only to silence Henry, but to retrieve something. The figure Mrs. Hartnell saw, the supposed apparition, had not been a ghost at all, but a man in his cassock, pale in the lamplight, casting something into the water. At dusk she walked once more to the edge of the pond. The constables had cleared their cordons. The place lay quiet except for the whisper of the reeds. Kneeling carefully, she peered into the shallows, where a glint caught her eye, a flash of dull silver beneath the silt. She reached in with her walking stick, and after several careful prods, drew out a small locket, tarnished and bound with a faded blue ribbon. Inside was a miniature portrait, blurred with water damage, yet the faint outline of a young woman's face could still be discerned. On the opposite side was a lock of dark hair. She held it a moment in her gloved hand, feeling the faint chill of its metal, and then, very quietly, replaced it where she'd found it. Some things, she knew, were better left to rest. That evening, as the village lights came on one by one, Inspector Graves called at her cottage to deliver the news. The vicar had taken ill in his cell, stricken by what the doctor called a sudden failure of the heart. There would be no trial. The matter, he said, was finished. Miss Marple poured him tea and listened as he spoke of procedures, of reports and statements. When he finished, she said softly, "It's curious, isn't it, Inspector, how often truth and punishment fail to meet on the same road? The one travels quietly, the other never arrives in time." He looked at her with a weary smile. "You've a way of seeing to the heart of things, Miss Marple. Most folks are satisfied once they've got a culprit." "Perhaps because it's simpler than seeing the whole of human frailty," she replied, "but there's always a cost, even when justice looks tidy on the paper." When he left, she drew the curtains and sat by the fire. Outside, the rain began again, soft this time, almost cleansing. She thought of Henry's music, of Alice's letters, of a locket glimmering quietly beneath the water. The village would go on, of course. Harvest festivals would return. Mrs. Hartnell would soon be telling the tale of the ghost by the parish pond in tones of delighted dread, and the world would shuffle gently forward, pretending it had learned something. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the lamplight. "Poor souls," she murmured to herself, not unkindly. "So eager to forget when it is remembrance that saves us." And from the lane outside, faint and low beneath the sound of the rain, came the echo of a church bell tolling the hour, each note fading into silence, as though the village itself were exhaling the last breath of a long, sorrowful confession. The days that followed seemed to stretch longer than usual, as though St. Mary Mead itself was reluctant to move forward. The church bell no longer rang for morning prayers, and the vicarage curtains remained drawn. A soft melancholy settled over the village, not loud or dramatic, but woven into its rhythms, the silence of parishioners who spoke more softly when passing the church, the lowered eyes of Mrs. Hartnell when she crossed the green, the faint, awkward kindnesses extended to Miss Collis when she went to the grocer's. The pond, too, had changed. It no longer reflected the sky clearly. The water had turned darker, streaked with autumn leaves that drifted like quiet reminders of what had been lost. Miss Marple, for her part, resumed her life as though nothing in the world had altered. She tended her garden, attended her sewing circle, and listened with that polite stillness which was her sharpest form of attention. Yet beneath the calm routine, her thoughts remained fixed on the smallest of puzzles, a thread left untied, a whisper that refused to still itself. The locket she had returned to the pond lingered in her mind, but it was not the locket itself that troubled her. It was the way it had been tied, the faded blue ribbon looped twice around, knotted neatly, almost reverently. That had not been a gesture of guilt or concealment. It had been one of remembrance. Someone had placed it there not to hide the past, but to honor it. On the third morning, she received a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, narrow, precise, written in ink that trembled only slightly, as if from an aging hand. "You are kind, Miss Marple, to let the water keep its secret, but you should know it was not he who left it there. She asked me to." There was no signature, only a small pressed flower enclosed, a forget-me-not, dry and delicate. Miss Marple read the note twice before setting it down beside her teacup. The phrasing was peculiar. She asked me to. The only she who could have done so was Alice Tynan, and Alice had been dead these 20 years. Unless, of course, someone had known her well enough to speak in her stead. A sister, perhaps, or a friend. The Tynans had left the district after the scandal, but the name, faint and faded, lingered in the parish records. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on the postmistress, Mrs. Weatherby, who, being a woman of considerable memory and even greater curiosity, recalled nearly everything worth recalling. "Tynan?" she said, adjusting her spectacles. "Yes, I remember them. The mother was a dressmaker. The father worked the estate before the war. There was a younger daughter, Margaret, or Maggie as she was called. She married, moved to Whitcomb, if memory serves. Nice girl, quiet. Wrote to me once about forwarding a parcel after her sister's death. Why do you ask, Miss Marple?" "Oh, just an idle curiosity," said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. "I dislike unfinished stories, you know." That evening she penned a short note to Whitcomb and sent it off with the next morning's post. By the end of the week, she received a reply on pale stationery, scented faintly of lavender. "My dear Miss Marple, I have long awaited the day someone would ask about Alice. I was told once that silence was the only kindness left to us, but silence breeds ghosts, and I have lived with them too long. If you would visit me, there are things I must say before I join her." 2 days later, Miss Marple took the early train, arriving in Whitcomb beneath a cold silver light. The house was small and neat, with ivy curling around the windows and a pot of violets on the step. Mrs. Margaret Tynan, now Mrs. Roff, greeted her with trembling hands. Her hair was white, but her eyes still carried the same clear sadness that comes from long-kept truths. "She was never meant to die that way," Margaret said once the tea was poured. "Alice was frightened, yes, but she believed Henry loved her. He wrote to her, promised to make things right. The vicar found out, told him to end it quietly for everyone's sake, but she couldn't bear the shame. The night she died, she went to the church, not the pond. I think she meant to plead with him." Her hands tightened around her cup. "But he turned her away. I know, because she left a note for me, one I was told to destroy. The next morning, she was gone." Miss Marple listened, her face a mask of still compassion. "And the locket?" she asked gently. Margaret's voice broke into a whisper. "He returned it to me afterward. The vicar said she'd wanted Henry to have it back, but I couldn't bear to see it. Years later, when he came to me again, older and trembling, he said he'd kept it all this time and that he'd throw it into the water when his conscience grew too loud. He never did. So when I heard of his death, I sent someone to do it for me." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The note I received, she asked me to, that was from you then?" Margaret's eyes widened. "No, I've not written to anyone since your first letter, but She hesitated, frowning faintly. "There is a man here in Whitcomb. Mr. Price retired here after leaving St. Mary Mead. I saw him once near the church pond, years after Alice's death, and he told me something that chilled me. He said the water remembers everything, and that one day it would call him home." Miss Marple sat back, her expression unreadable, the faintest flicker of realization passing through her gaze. When she returned to St. Mary Mead that evening, the mist was rising again over the fields. She paused by the pond, where the water lay still and deep, reflecting the faint moonlight. Somewhere beneath its surface rested the locket, the ribbon, the letters, and perhaps the last fragment of conscience that bound all those lives together. And as she turned away, she noticed the faintest ripple in the water, though no wind stirred. For a moment it seemed to her that someone, or something, had stirred below, listening. But Miss Marple merely smiled, calm and almost wistful, and whispered, "Yes, my dear, the water remembers. It always does." The following morning brought with it a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The fog lay heavy across the green, swallowing the rooftops and turning every sound into a whisper. Miss Marple awoke earlier than usual, her mind alert, though she could not have said why. There was no knock at the door, no call from the post, yet she felt it, a quiet summons, the kind that comes not from people, but from unfinished truths. She dressed with care, fastening the small silver brooch she wore whenever she sensed an ending approaching, and made her way toward the pond. It was deserted. Even the ducks had vanished, perhaps frightened by their own reflections. She stood at the water's edge, her breath forming pale clouds, and watched the faint disturbance near the far bank, just enough to disturb the perfect surface. "You're not quite done, are you?" she murmured softly. The ripples spread outward, slow and rhythmic, until they touched the bank at her feet. She had no illusions about ghosts, but she understood better than most that guilt leaves its own weather behind, and that sometimes it takes years to clear. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of someone standing by the gate, a tall, stooped figure wrapped in a heavy coat. For a fleeting moment, her heart quickened. The silhouette was so like the late vicar's that it seemed the fog had conjured him back. But as the figure stepped forward, she saw the truth. It was Inspector Graves, looking oddly unsettled. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat. "Didn't expect to find you out here. I was on my way to see you." "Then perhaps it's the pond that brought us together," she said with a faint smile. "It does seem to collect confidences." He gave a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You might be right about that. We had a message come through this morning. Mr. Price has been found. Dead. Drowned. Not far from Whitcomb, near the old church mill pond." Miss Marple's eyes did not widen, nor did she feign surprise. "I see. Then it seems the water has taken back what belonged to it." Graves frowned. He'd left a note. Only a line or two. Said he'd heard the voice again, and that it was time to answer for what he'd done. No one else around. No signs of struggle. But it's strange, isn't it? After all these years. Why now? "Because silence," Miss Marple said quietly, "has an echo. He mistook it for forgiveness, but it was only time repeating itself. Guilt can sleep for years, Inspector, but it never dies of old age." They walked back together in near silence, the mist thinning as they approached the village. Graves spoke only once more, his tone softer than she had ever heard it. "You know, Miss Marple, I sometimes think you see things the rest of us miss. Not evidence exactly, but the shape of truth." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But it isn't seeing, Inspector. It's remembering. People behave as they always have, only the names change." That afternoon the village was unusually quiet. Word of Price's death had travelled fast, but it carried none of the sharp gossip that usually accompanied scandal. Instead, there was a muted sorrow, as though the pond's final offering had exhausted the village's appetite for stories. Even Mrs. Hartnell, who could turn tragedy into theatre within the hour, spoke of the affair in whispers. Miss Marple noticed this with a kind of weary gratitude. It meant, she thought, that perhaps the dead could rest at last. Toward evening, she received a final letter, this one in an envelope smudged with damp, the handwriting weak but unmistakably female. Dear Miss Marple, you were right. I did not send the first note. But I knew who did. He came to me before he went. Said the voice wouldn't let him be, that it was not the vicar he'd seen that night after all, but her. He said she stood by the water, waiting. I told him he was only hearing what he'd buried. But I think now, perhaps she was waiting for all of them. It was signed simply Margaret Roth. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, placed it in her drawer beside the earlier note, and closed it with a gentle click. Outside, twilight settled, and the mist returned, veiling the cottages in soft silver. She sat by the fire, her needles moving slowly, her mind wandering between memory and speculation. She thought of Henry Collis, haunted by the melody he could never finish, of Alice, whose despair had been treated as shame, of the vicar, whose piety had rotted into fear, and of Price, who had mistaken remorse for repentance. In their own ways, each had tried to silence the same voice, the voice that whispers when the world has turned away. As the clock chimed 9, she rose and went to the window. The pond was just visible through the fog, a faint glimmer of reflected moonlight trembling across its surface. For a moment, she fancied she saw a ripple again. Just one, small and deliberate, as though a hand had brushed lightly against the water from below. But she did not look away in fear. Instead, she whispered softly into the glass, "Rest now, my dear. They've all heard you at last." She stood a while longer, her reflection mingling with the mist. Behind her, the fire burned low, its light flickering across the room like a heartbeat. The village slept, unaware that its ghosts had finally found peace. And when she at last drew the curtains and turned away, the silence that followed was not heavy, but tender, a silence that spoke not of secrets buried, but of souls remembered. The next morning dawned unusually clear, as if the fog that had so long draped itself over St. Mary Mead had finally lifted. The air was cool and brittle with the promise of frost, and for the first time in weeks, the sun struck the pond in a sheen of pale gold. Miss Marple noticed it at once from her window, the way the light touched the water, as though the village's quiet burden had been acknowledged and gently set down. But she also knew that peace, once disturbed, is rarely absolute. The dead had settled, yes, but the living, she suspected, had not. By mid-morning, the post arrived. Among the circulars and church notices was an envelope addressed in a firm, deliberate hand she did not recognize. She slit it open carefully. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, the ink faintly smudged, as though written in haste. "Miss Marple, you do not know me, but I was once under the care of Mr. Clement, your late vicar. I believe he confessed to something he did not do. I beg you, look again at what happened by the pond." There was no signature, only an address written at the bottom. Melchester Asylum. Miss Marple read the words twice, her brows knitting slightly. The letter's tone was not malicious, nor was it raving. It had a strange calmness to it, the kind that came from long silence. She dressed, took her shawl, and went out to see Inspector Graves. He was at the station, bent over paperwork, his expression a mixture of fatigue and wary irritation when she entered. "I know that look," he said dryly. "It means you've come to unsettle my nice, tidy reports." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I do apologize, Inspector. but it seems your tidy reports may have left a thread or two hanging. I received a letter this morning from a patient at Melchester Asylum. He claims that the vicar's confession was false." Graves blinked, frowning. "Another madman seeking attention, most likely. We've had 2 or 3 letters about that case already. Word spreads, you know. People fancy themselves prophets when there's tragedy about." "Perhaps," she said gently. "But this one seems to know something. He mentions the pond, not as the place where Collis died, but as the place where she was seen again. Not a ghost, Inspector, but a witness." Graves straightened slightly. "A witness? After 20 years?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "The village forgets quickly, but water does not. It reflects everything that leans too close. I wonder whether someone else saw that reflection and has been living with it ever since." By the next day, Graves had arranged for the asylum superintendent to grant them an interview. Miss Marple insisted on accompanying him. She had, she said, a better ear for the peculiar. They traveled in the inspector's motor car through the pale countryside, where winter fields gleamed under frost. Melchester Asylum rose from the mist like a half-remembered cathedral. Tall, grey, windowed high, surrounded by orderly gardens, too neat to feel kind. The patient was called Mr. Harold Tynan. When Miss Marple heard the name, she felt a faint stir of recognition. "Alice's brother," she murmured. Graves looked startled. "I thought the family moved away." "They did," Miss Marple said softly. "But perhaps not all of them escaped what they left behind." They were led to a small visiting room with cold white walls. The man who entered was thin, his hair silvered, though he could not yet have been 60. His eyes were sharp but unfocused, as if seeing both the present and something beyond it. He inclined his head politely to Miss Marple. "You're the lady who solved the matter at St. Mary Mead," he said. "I've followed it in the papers. You were close, you know, but not quite there." "Then perhaps you might guide us the rest of the way," she said gently. "You wrote that the vicar's confession was false. What makes you so certain?" He hesitated, hands trembling slightly on the table. "Because I was there. Not that night, years before. I saw the beginning of it all. Alice's death wasn't an accident, nor was it despair. It was silence that killed her." He spoke in broken rhythm, the words coming like fragments of an old melody. "Alice went to the vicar, yes, but not to plead, to warn. She'd found out that Henry Collis was being blackmailed. Price was involved, but there was someone else. Someone higher. Someone who used the letters to keep them both quiet. She threatened to tell, and the next day, she was gone. I told my father what I'd overheard, but he beat me for lying. Later, I saw the vicar burying something near the pond, a box. I never told anyone, and by the time I did, they said I'd imagined it." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "You're saying there was another man involved? Someone who might still be alive?" Harold gave a thin smile. "Alive? Oh, Inspector, sin doesn't die when the sinner does. It just changes hands. The one who arranged it all became a bishop, you see. A fine man, beloved by the church, but he used the vicar's guilt to keep his own soul spotless." He paused, breathing unevenly. "The night Henry died, that bishop came to St. Mary Mead. I saw him. He went to the pond. When they left the asylum, dusk had already fallen. Graves drove in silence, his knuckles white on the wheel. Miss Marple sat beside him, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "A bishop," she said at last, her tone thoughtful. It would explain why the vicar never named another. He confessed not only his own sin, but another's, one he dared not expose. "Do you believe the fellow?" Graves asked, glancing at her. "I believe," Miss Marple said slowly, "that madness often springs from the truth no one else will hear. And if the bishop did come to St. Mary Mead that night, the pond may still hold the last piece of his secret." They reached the village as the moon rose, pale and unblinking above the fields. Miss Marple stepped from the car and looked once more toward the water. It was utterly still now, yet she thought she could almost see beneath it the faint shimmer of something small and metallic lying deep among the reeds. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, almost to herself, "we shall ask the pond one final question." And as she turned away, the wind rose softly behind her, stirring the surface into ripples that glinted like silver threads, threads that seemed at last ready to be drawn up into the light. The next morning, frost silvered every hedge and rooftop in St. Mary Mead, and the air carried that peculiar, crystalline silence which seems to suspend time itself. Miss Marple, who had slept little, was already awake before dawn. She stood by her window, watching the faint wisp of mist curl over the pond like breath from something sleeping. It was not fear that stirred her, but the unmistakable tug of unfinished truth. Even in her old age, she had learned that some lies, especially those dressed as virtue, have longer lives than the ones who spoke them. By 8 o'clock, she was at Inspector Graves' office. He was finishing his tea, clearly startled to see her so early. "You've a look about you, Miss Marple," he said cautiously. "I've seen it before, in cats that smell a mouse under the floorboards." She smiled faintly. "A fair comparison, Inspector. I've been thinking of our conversation with poor Harold Tynan. What if the bishop he spoke of truly did return to St. Mary Mead that night? If so, we may yet have another thread to pull." Graves leaned back, skeptical. "The church won't like that sort of talk. The Bishop of Melchester is a respected man, had his name in the Times just last month." "Respect," Miss Marple said gently, "is not immunity, Inspector. If this bishop had reason to fear that the past might resurface, the letters, the affair, the pond, he may have taken steps to ensure silence once more. Mr. Price's death, for instance. We have assumed it was remorse, but what if it was persuasion?" Graves frowned, setting down his cup. "You mean murder." "I mean," she corrected softly, "tidying up loose ends. And a man of the cloth, Inspector, tends to be most dangerous when he believes he is cleansing sin." Within the hour, they were on the road to Melchester again. The drive was grey and cold, the hedgerows glinting with frost. Miss Marple sat quietly, her gloved hands folded, while Graves's jaw worked in silent unease. When they reached the bishop's residence, a stately, ivy-covered building that seemed to breathe solemnity, they were met by a tall man in clerical black with a silver cross, gleaming at his throat. "Bishop Harland," Graves said, producing his card. "A matter of inquiry regarding your late colleague, Reverend Clement of St. Mary Mead." The bishop's smile was courteous but distant. "A tragedy," he said gravely. "The poor man's passing weighed heavily upon me. I was fond of him." Miss Marple regarded him with polite mildness. "You knew him quite well, then?" "He served under you, I believe, before his appointment to the parish." "Indeed," said Harland, folding his hands. "A devoted man, troubled perhaps toward the end. Conscience can be a cruel companion." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly, "especially when one carries another's as well as one's own." The bishop's eyes flickered, only slightly, but enough. He recovered quickly. "I'm afraid I don't follow, madam." Graves stepped forward. "We have reason to believe, sir, that Reverend Clement may have taken the blame for another's misdeeds, a cover-up involving the death of a young woman many years ago." The bishop's face remained impassive, though his voice thinned. "Old gossip resurrected by the wicked, Inspector. The man confessed, did he not? There's little sense in disturbing his peace." "His peace, perhaps," Miss Marple said evenly, "but not the girl's. Alice Tynan has had none these 20 years, and the water that hides her memory has grown restless. You see, Bishop, truth is a very patient swimmer." A faint tremor ran through his hand where it gripped the chair. "You're speaking nonsense," he said sharply. "I will not dignify superstition." "Superstition," she said with quiet finality, "does not write letters from the asylum, nor leave ripples on still water at dawn." You came to St. Mary Mead that night, Bishop Harland. You met Henry Collis by the pond and urged him to destroy the evidence, the letters that tied you to the affair. And when he refused, you helped him into the water, as you once helped Alice Tynan. Tell me, was it pity or the same fear that's now written in your face?" For a long moment there was silence. Then the bishop's shoulders sagged, and his gaze drifted toward the tall window where weak sunlight fell across the floor. "You think me a monster," he said quietly. "But you weren't there. You didn't see what one whisper could do to a lifetime's work. The church, my calling, it would have been destroyed. I meant to spare them. Spare everyone." Graves's voice was low. "And what of those you didn't spare?" The bishop gave a long, hollow sigh. "I prayed for them. I thought it would be enough." When they left the residence, the air outside felt colder, the light sharper. Graves looked grim. He'll deny everything when it's official. Men like that always do. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, stepping carefully along the frosted path. "But the pond remembers, Inspector, and before long, others will too. The truth, once disturbed, has a way of rising to the surface, however deep it was sunk." That night, she returned home to her quiet cottage. The village lay hushed, its chimneys breathing pale smoke into the darkening sky. She lit her lamp, made her tea, and sat beside the window, looking once more toward the pond. The moon hung over it like a silver coin, and for the briefest instant she thought she saw two figures reflected there, a man kneeling, a woman standing beside him, her face soft and luminous, as though the water had finally given back what it owed. Then the image dissolved into ripples, and only the still pond remained. Miss Marple sighed, folded her hands, and whispered to the empty room, "Peace at last, my dear Alice. Peace for all of you." Outside, the church bell tolled softly over the sleeping village, each note carried on the cold wind like a benediction, or perhaps a confession whispered too late. Winter deepened quietly over St. Mary Mead, settling its stillness over cottages and gardens as though the village itself wished to draw a curtain over what had passed. Yet for all its peaceful air, there remained a faint sense of awakening. A gentle shift, like a house that had been asleep for too long and was only now breathing evenly again. The scandal that had threatened to darken its reputation faded, as such things often do, into a softened memory, retold over teacups with less fear and more wistful pity. The official inquiry, led by Inspector Graves, concluded with restrained ceremony. The bishop's sudden illness, some said brought on by the shock of accusation, others by a guilty conscience long suppressed, prevented any formal trial. His resignation arrived quietly in the papers a fortnight later, couched in phrases about spiritual fatigue. The church saw fit to let the matter close. There would be no confessions beyond those already whispered, no charges, no public scandal. But those who had seen the look in his eyes that morning in Melchester would never forget it. Not the anger of an innocent man, but the hollow terror of one who had been found out by forces far quieter than law. Miss Marple, for her part, asked for no recognition. When Graves stopped by her cottage to thank her, she merely poured him tea and nodded when he said, half ruefully, "I don't suppose I'll ever know how you managed to be right when none of us saw past the surface." She smiled, that serene, grandmotherly smile that hid an unerring precision. "One learns, Inspector, that evil seldom hides in shadows. It sits in sunlight and wears respectability like its finest hat. The trick is to look for the little inconsistencies, the things too tidy, too polished. Conscience rarely leaves clean edges." He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "I dare say you'd have made a formidable detective in my line of work." "Oh, my dear man," she said, eyes twinkling, "I've been one all my life, only without the uniform." After he left, she tidied the tea things and went to the window once more. The pond lay frozen now, smooth and opaque beneath its thin crust of ice. Children had scattered small stones across its surface earlier that afternoon, and now the pebbles lay motionless, trapped mid-glide. The sight made her pause. Beneath that frozen calm, there was still water, still movement, still memory. She found that comforting. A week later, Miss Marple received a parcel from Whitcomb. Inside was a small, neatly wrapped box and a note written in Margaret Roff's careful hand. "Dear Miss Marple, I have no wish to keep what was born of sorrow. I think it belongs to the place where it began, and perhaps you will know what to do with it." The box contained the locket, the same one Miss Marple had once returned to the pond. Its surface had been cleaned, the blue ribbon replaced with a new one. The portrait within had faded further, the girl's face now little more than a blur of soft color, but there was a curious peace in it, as though the years had gentled her even in miniature. Miss Marple sat holding it for a long while before taking her shawl and walking to the churchyard. The air was cold enough to make her breath plume like smoke. She crossed to the edge of the pond, its surface gleaming under a pale, indifferent moon. For a moment she hesitated. Then she knelt, broke the thin ice with a careful hand, and let the locket sink slowly back into the water. It disappeared without sound, leaving only a faint ring that spread outward, touching every corner of the pond before fading into stillness. "There," she murmured. "Now it's all where it belongs." When she rose, she noticed a small reflection glimmering just beneath the surface. Not the moon this time, but a pair of soft, steady eyes looking upward, calm and unafraid. Miss Marple smiled faintly, the kind of smile reserved for those who know how to see without needing proof. She turned homeward, her steps measured but light. As she walked, the church bell tolled once, its sound round and gentle in the cold air. Behind her, the pond lay quiet again, its secrets finally stilled. Yet in that stillness, there was no more dread, only remembrance. In the weeks that followed, St. Mary Mead returned to its ordinary rhythms, the clatter of teacups at the Blue Boar, Mrs. Hartnell's cheerful gossip at the post office, the choir's voices rising again on Sunday mornings. The tragedy of the Parish Pond became, like all stories in small villages, a tale retold and reshaped, each version softening the edges a little more. Some spoke of ghosts, others of human frailty, but none doubted that the water, for all its silence, had finally given back what it owed. And Miss Marple, sitting by her hearth with her knitting and her quiet satisfaction, thought of them all, the girl, the organist, the vicar, the bishop. Each had played their part in the slow, sorrowful symphony of human weakness. But she also thought, as she often did, that there was mercy and truth, even when it arrived too late for earthly justice. The clock ticked softly. The kettle began to hum. Outside, frost gathered once more along the hedges, turning the village silver under the night sky. Miss Marple reached to turn down her lamp, and in the last glow before the light went out, she whispered, half to herself and half to the sleeping village beyond, "Nothing is ever truly forgotten, my dears, but at least tonight everything is forgiven." And with that she closed her eyes, the faint sound of water and wind carrying the memory of peace through St. Mary Mead.